Good day.
Lesson 14, Industrialization. I'm Mr. Raine.
And Mr. Suter.
So Russia in the 1920s, what was it like? Under the NEP, don't forget, Russia's had some small industry, and that it basically was relatively backwards. And by backwards, I don't mean, the doors on the backside. Oh, terrible.
That's a bad joke.
That's a terrible joke. What I mean is that compared to the large factories in Britain that were producing modern equipment, Russia was basically run by small, tiny factories that were producing, in some cases, equipment that was modern, but very inefficiently. They weren't producing it in mass quantities. They weren't using a technology like the assembly line pioneered by Henry Ford in Detroit in the early 20th century. These sort of backwards industries were controlled by a mix of state and private individuals. Worker productivity was low, meaning that they didn't work very hard. They didn't churn out a lot of things to sell. The levels of access to things such as basic infrastructure, roads, rails, and electricity was low, which also really hampers Russia's ability to increase its factory size. They don't have enough infrastructure to ship anything that's produced or the electricity to continue to run the factory. So overall, compared with other countries, Russia, despite its size, was incredibly weak industrially.
Absolutely right. The factories did not have machinery, modern machines to make the stuff quickly, did not have access to raw materials, etc., etc. So what Stalin decides is he is going to industrialize. Industrialize is to make an economy bigger, particularly through investing in factories, both more factories, more workers, but also into increasing the quality of the machinery that's made, to increase the efficiency. That means how much you make and how quickly you make it of these factories. Why does he do this? Well, a couple of reasons. In 1927, there's a fake Zinoviev letter. We don't need to worry too much about it, but essentially Britain breaks off international relations and makes noises about war. At the same time, Russia's having problems with Poland and France. And there's a fear that at some point Russia's very aware that everyone else hates it because it's communist, there might be a war. And in a war, if you are importing all the weapons and all the stuff that you need to run an economy from your enemies, they aren't going to trade with you once you're at war. So what Stalin wants is self-sufficiency. Stalin wants Russia to almost be able to make everything it needs in case it goes to war with anyone, and therefore its trade is disrupted. As well as this, there is a slight communist ideal part, particularly amongst, and Stalin uses this to some extent when we talk about socialism in one country, but the NEP is basically capitalism. I mean, it's lighter capitalism. It's not quite as there's not billionaire stockbrokers. But the current system encourages greed and encourages capitalism. And actually, the communist idea is what we need to do is bring everything back under state control, run it for the workers, not for profit, but for the people. As well as this, NEP means that people run their own affairs, and Stalin always, as your son always wants, he wants more control over workers' lives, he wants more control of the economy. Control is good. If the state controls the economy, Stalin, instead of the state wants control. And he also decides that in 1927, we talked about socialism in one country before, the struggle for power. Stalin decides that he needs to sell himself as different to Bukharin. Bukharin, remember, is the NEP guy. So he suddenly decides that socialism in one country at this point means state control and industrialization. So it's also used to help him win the leadership struggle. Because now he says, this is my idea and I'm different to Bukharin because Bukharin is the NEP guy and my idea is better. Industrialization controlled by the state.
So how did it work in total? At the top, you have to really consider the fact that there's accountability, centralization, and target mania. Okay, accountability effectively means if you do not do it, you will be held accountable. In other words, you could pay for it through your life by having, being purged or so on and so forth. Centralization means that it's going to be controlled from one overall group or one overall organization attached to the Communist Party and mostly working directly for Stalin. And this will sort of organize industrialization, and the idea of target mania, the idea that you have to produce X amount of things, and if you don't produce X amount of things, there will be problems. So these targets are lofty, they're hard to meet, they're incredibly high in terms of what needs to be produced, and they're very, very ambitious. So the overall organization set up to overrun this was called Gosplan, and Gosplan set the overall targets for an industry. Then from that overall target, each region was told its fraction of that overall target and what they would have to produce to meet it. So let's pretend it sets a coal production limit, and you would have to mine X amount of coal. Each region is told that their portion of the overall coal production what it would be. That region sets targets for each mine, factory, whatever it happens to be, and they would contribute to the overall target. And the manager of each factory or mine set targets for each foreman or supervisor, or the person who was in charge of the employees digging that coal or making that steel, and ensured that they produced enough to meet the overall target set by Gosplan. And then the foreman sets targets for each individual and each shift to produce X amount of things.
Absolutely, and this is what Mr. Raine is talking about in terms of accountability. Say Gosplan says we need 1 million more tons of coal. They send to each region, you have to do 100,000 of each million tons of coal. Each region then says you have to do 10 million tons of coal. Each manager says you each have to do 1 million tons of coal, and therefore each worker has to do 1 million tons of coal. If it's very obvious where people fail to do this because you haven't done what you were told, and this is to make people and managers work hard, and also to make sure that the centralisation of what is done, the centralisation of the economy is much more focused. People can't get away with being lazy anymore. People are being told you have to make this much. It's a ridiculous high target, but they have to follow it through, or else their name is on a list. They might not be killed, they might be fired, they might be sent to a gulag, who knows what. So Stalin decides, as part of this, to start something called the 5-year plans. His first 5-year plan, the astute of you will notice, takes 4 years. This is a common thing. They always finish a year early and he changes his mind to go to something else. The first 5-year plan focuses on heavy industry. That's iron, coal, steel, electricity, chemicals. Stuff which is needed to work, to be used to make other things. There's no point trying to make tanks until you've got enough iron. There's no point trying to make fertilizers until you've got enough chemicals. So the big focus is the raw materials, the basic stuff you need to make other things. And this is relatively sensible in reality. If they'd said make loads of tractors but there wasn't enough iron being produced, therefore that was a waste point of time. So in reality, what they did is they focused all their efforts, all their time, all their targets on these narrow groups. Other stuff like particularly consumer goods like bicycles or radios were ignored because that's a waste of energy, a waste of worker time, a waste of money. Towards this, foreign companies and individuals were invited to come to Russia to help industrialize. For example, Ford, who we mentioned before, comes and basically creates the Russian car industry. It gives lots of advice about that. Very interesting that Ford, the mega capitalist that's Ford, is giving advice to Russia. Stalin is more focused on making sure that the industrialization works than any ideological things. The targets were actually reached in 1932, so Stalin raises them. And obviously they don't reach those raised ones. This can be seen, the way they go about it is essentially, as part of targets, as well as that, they end up building whole new towns which are focused on particular industries. For example, Magnitogorsk, which was basically a village with about 100 people or so, which over the course of 2 years, between 1928 to 1930, goes from a 100 people village to a huge steelworks, producing almost half of Russian steel, and a population of about 400,000 or 500,000 people. And it just keeps growing. Made from nowhere.
There's a real fetish here for gigantic industrial projects such as dams or steelworks, and the commonly known term is Gigantomania takes over, where the Russians start building enormous production facilities.
Absolutely right. And Stalingrad is another one. All the factories are being made in Stalingrad. Everyone at Stalingrad basically works in a tractor factory. Stalingrad will be, of course, the turning point of the war. Any military history geeks amongst you will know Stalingrad's sort of name.
In particular, the central tractor factory, where famously, if you've read some of the stories of Stalingrad, the snipers hid out and worked. So if you've seen Enemy at the Gates, terrible film, but generally speaking takes place in and around the tractor factory in Stalingrad.
And the first 5-year plan is broadly successful in its stated goals. The amount of coal produced doubles between 1928 to 1932, from 35 million tons to 64 million tons. The amount of iron produced, again, roughly doubles, from 6.7 million tons to 12.1 million tons. However, It is held back by shortages of raw materials and poor transport links. I don't know why there's random A there. What it means is eventually there comes to a point where they can't make anymore because there's no more steel in the ground, or no iron in the ground, no more coal in the ground, which can be made quicker. As well as this, we have factories getting the raw pig iron, but there's no railway system to carry it over to that magnetic ores to turn it into steel. So it just piles up in the sort of local areas of the coal mines and the iron mines. So there's a lack there, and that's going to be addressed in the next 5-year plan. As well as this, managers are desperate. They have to meet their coal targets. So if you're in charge of a coal mine, for example, and you're told you have to get 20 million tonnes by the end of the year, that's a ridiculous figure. And you know you run the risk of being purged. Is purge happening at the same time? Or fired, or losing your job, or whatever, if you don't reach that target. Now, the people to feel sorry for this entire story is the managers, because they are screwed, messed up to some extent by everyone in the story. So the managers often deal with bribery to try and get workers to stay, but as well as that, really illegal dealings. For example, turning a blind eye to workers ambushing equipment on the work, which is meant for a different factory, but stealing it off the trains in order to help themselves, which leads to some inefficiency. As well as that, there's actually a decline in the amount of stuff produced in some consumer industries, for example, bikes, etc., etc. And actually, the targets on chemicals show a large failure. And a big thing you'll see, and this is common throughout, if I'm a factory manager and I have to make 20 million tonnes of steel, I'm going to do it quickly. If my target is only to get a certain amount, I do it quickly. It doesn't matter if it's poor quality, because no one's judging me on quality. They're judging me on the amount made. So generally what happens is the quality of steel is very poor because it's rushed, and if it's bad, they just chuck it on the route, on the train or on the truck anyway, because who cares? They need to give their amount. And this is a really common thing all the way through. Every 5-year plan, the goods made, there's no quality control, because if it turns out to be bad, just shut it on, because we just need to make our target to some extent.
So the problems with the workers. There's massive movement from rural to urban areas to meet the needs of industries. Towns and cities spring up literally overnight. And workers are in high demand. And these people that they bring into the factories are not really used to the rules of regular work. They haven't worked in shifts. They haven't worked according to bells. And as such, they don't really like it. Factory work is tough. Stalinist factory work is really tough. And there's huge turnovers. In July 1931, 12,000 workers are turned over. In other words, they're gotten rid of because they're poorly motivated, they're lazy, they're incompetent, they lack the skills needed by the industry. So Stalin needs to move to sort of address this. In 1931, he drops rules against paying different wages. It's instead starting paying people for every item produced instead of paying them just a blanket, $8 an hour or 8 rubles an hour, whatever it happens to be. In 1930 to 33, sort of also with the purges, harsher punishments, including firing, loss of homes and benefits, kick in for workers who don't produce enough.
Or just don't turn up to work.
Yeah, and by 1930 onwards, they start to use forced labor. Prisoners from the gulags, 300,000 for instance, are taken and to build something called the Baltic White Sea Canal, which is a massive industrial scheme. And they basically just force people to work as slave laborers. And of course, the punishments for not working as a slave laborer is death. And of course, propaganda to start selling the idea that working is good and to work for the country and to work for the communists is the duty of every good Russian.
And it's important to know while this isn't perfect, this does improve to some extent the amount of people work, that they stay in job. Turnover is really bad at the start. Basically, people just leave their jobs and go to a different job because everyone needs workers. Like, they can go anywhere for a job. Whereas now that they're a little bit more controlled, they do work a little bit harder, though it's not perfect yet. So we move on to the second 5-year plan in due course. Now, the second 5-year plan is better managed. I think Stalin, to some extent, has learned from his mistakes. There's a little bit more there's still the focus on heavy industry, because it's still not as good as it could be. But there's also much more focus on communications, particularly rail. What that means is we need to create build a rail network so that the goods can be moved around, so that the iron ore producer, iron mine X, can be taken to the steel mill at Magnitogorsk or wherever, producing steel, and that steel can be taken to the tractor factory at Stalingrad and made into a tractor as quickly and efficiently as possible. If it's just lying around at some place because it's not where it's meant to be, you're wasting time, you're wasting workers. They learned from their mistakes about setting too ambitious targets, but the target's still high. And as well as that, the increased labour discipline, and that's that stuff we mentioned before about if you don't turn up to work on time, you don't turn up to work at all, you could get fined, you could lose your home, you could be even, in extreme cases at this point, turned around, and turned sort of kicked out and turned into a gulag, for example. As well as that, there's a slightly more focus on consumer goods because people need the basic necessities to keep going. And there's much clearer planning from Gosban about how the targets will be used and increased training of the workers. So we see a little bit more focus on trying to actually make it better. Before, Gosban said, here's a target, deal with it. But now Gosban's helping manage to work out how they can increase efficiency. Maybe there needs to be a rail link here or there. Maybe more equipment needs to be given here. There's tougher rules of, and there's a blank, I don't know why there's a blank, tougher rules of labour discipline as well. Is even more emphasis on, by 1936, for example, if you are absent, you can now get fired, or even you'll get 10 years hard labour in the gulag. So much tougher rules around. You need to be on time, you need to work hard. If you are seen as unproductive, you can also be thrown in a gulag for 10 years hard labour. And we see this is broadly successful. There's a massive growth in rails, stuff like railway tracks built in between factories and across Russia, meaning that things can be moved much quicker. The amount of armaments, that's weapons and tanks and guns and all that sort of stuff, production triples. Coal between 1933 and 1937 goes up or doubles from 64 million tons to 120 million tons, and the amount of electricity produced goes from 45 mega kilowatts to 80 mega kilowatts. So there is a general improvement. And actually amongst the Russians themselves, 1934 to 1936 are known as the good years to some extent. Obviously collectivization is sort of calmed down a bit, but that doesn't really affect them. It's mostly the idea of actually managers are being nice. There's an increase in training, there's slightly less slightly more money being spent on paying you more if you work hard. And so as long as you work, as long as you turn up on time, as long as you don't take the mick, actually you can earn a decent living to some extent.
So the third five-year plan is a little bit different even such. So there's a continued focus on heavy industry, some consumer goods, but more acutely armaments. Now, if you consider where the world is in the late 1930s when the third five-year plan is announced, this makes a heck of a lot of sense. Hitler is in control of Germany. He's actively talking about Lebensraum, carving out a living space in the East. And there's the belief amongst the Soviet leadership that this man, Hitler, might mean business, and that Germany could, for the second time in about 25 years, be turning its attention to the East, and they could be facing invasion. So they begin producing some armaments in the third five-year plan and continuing on with the other things. Of course, this is cut short 3.5 years later because Hitler does, as expected, invade in 1941. There is some growth in the amount of armaments produced, but not enough really to fight off the Nazis in any significant way early on in the war.
And particularly because the armaments, the factories are told to make X many tanks, they make them quickly, they make them badly. And in the first half of World War II for Russia get really destroyed because the weapons they have and the tanks they have are really, really poor quality. So there's generally a slowdown in growth across indicators in how much industry is produced, or sorry, how much coal and steel is produced, and because mostly there's an increasing shortage of materials. Labor books and internal passports are created in 1938, and harsher labor discipline is instilled to try and push forward the third five-year plan, especially in 1940. By 1940, absenteeism, in other words, calling in sick for work, becomes a crime because the need for production is so acute as the Nazis have now taken over Poland and are now sitting on Russia's borders. I think the key thing about internal passports and labour books, it's about, even if you notice, there's a creeping, increasing control of the workers. Labour books and internal passports are the logical extension. If you remember that the internal passports existed under the Tsar, what this meant is you couldn't leave your region, okay, without permission. So none of this moving around workers to different areas. Someone knows your name and you are not allowed to leave unless you've got permission to go to a different industry. And labour books are essentially a log of what you have worked at, how good at work you are. You are actually graded by your manager. So you can turn up at a factory and go, this is how hard I've worked. If you got, like, say, a C minus, okay, you are going to be given a really terrible shift. And if there is a pattern emerging, for example, that you are across different factories seen as quite lazy, the NKVD might well get involved because you have to carry this around with you, and therefore, essentially, you are accounting for yourself to some extent. As well as this, the third five-year plan is really, really hurt by the purges. The purges, if you remember at this point, 1937 onwards, start focusing on the masses more. And the people who get purged particularly are the skilled managers, the skilled labour, and the slightly more intelligent people, to some extent, who Stalin sees as a threat. When you get rid of the managers who knows what they're doing and replace them with idiots who are maybe loyal, or at least not a threat, obviously things run less smoothly. If you get rid of a manager who can run the factory and replace him with someone who can't, what's the point? And the members of Gosplan in particular get purged, and the people who can organise the industry and understand where the bottlenecks are, that's where things are slowing that's production down, and they can fix it, are kicked out and replaced with loyal but stupid people, then obviously you are going to make less stuff because stuff is not really happening as much. And as well as that, there's a hard win for 1938, which also makes production much, much harder.
So a couple of the key features of the purges. The first one I mentioned earlier was called Gigantomania. These are the idea that they're huge projects, a lot of them built for propaganda purposes or just to build capacity where there wasn't some before. One of the best examples is the huge steelworks at Magnitogorsk, but another one in terms of building electrical capacity was the damming of the Dnieper Dam. Now this is one of the biggest dam projects in the world for the production of hydroelectric energy. Another famous one is the metro in Moscow, so the building of a subway underneath Moscow to move people around. The waste of materials was relatively acute in Gigantomania. The focus on these huge industrial projects drained materials where they could be used to help production in other areas, and oftentimes these weren't that important. But what they did do is they were a propaganda success. They gave the impression to the Russian people that they were modernizing, that the Soviet Union was making tremendous progress here in a relatively short period of time, which of course was Stalin's overall goal.
So another key feature to some extent is the Stakhanovites. Now, I'm sure you remember the story of Alexei Stakhanov, who mined 102 tons of coal in 5 hours. 6.5 tons was normal. He was lauded a hero in Pravda, the ironically named Truth, which is the official Soviet newspaper, edited in theory by Stalin. And what Stalin was doing here was trying to inspire other workers to work as hard as Stakhanov. Now, in reality, Stakhanov was mining an easy seam. It's actually not a massively exciting or difficult task, and he actually had help. But that doesn't matter. The story is good for Stalin, so therefore he's going to pretend as if Stakhanov is this superhuman effort. So what he encourages, and when it actually works, is trying to almost a competition of people trying to mimic Stakhanov by working really hard, making lots of iron in their iron factory, or making lots of tanks in their tank factory, and trying to beat records set by people in their factories. So by December 1935, this has gotten so big that the list of records that people in different areas who had made more tanks than ever been made in one shift before, people who had mined more iron than had ever been mined in one shift before, filled 2 huge volumes of books. So loads of people really get into this. There are shock brigades, which I misspelt. Obviously, you can tell how to spell brigades.
Should purge you.
You should purge me. The whole thing has been fairly shocking. The shock brigades are formed in order to of keen Stakhanovites who if a factory is underperforming, they turn up, they work really hard to suddenly make loads more iron where it's needed, and then they go away to a different coal mine. They might be mine lots of coal, and then they go to a different tractor factory to make more factories and make more tractors. And their idea, they turn up, they make loads of stuff, and they move on. And this Stakhanovite movement really suits ambitious workers. Ambitious workers who want to get, and remember that they can get paid more now, who really want to get paid more. If they're known as a Stakhanovite, someone who works very hard, they're going to get paid more. If you're an ambitious party secretary and you have lots of Stakhanovites, then they're going to produce more, and therefore you look good because your region, like Leningrad or Siberia, are producing lots more stuff. So you want to encourage Stakhanovites, and it suits desperate managers. Managers realize that they can use the Stakhanovite label to encourage workers to work harder, That means they're more likely to reach their targets. That means they're safer. So everyone sort of benefits from Stakhanovites, more if you're ambitious, at least. Stakhanovites also get extra rations, free housing, and free holidays as rewards to encourage people to work harder. And this is the big thing behind Stakhanovites is it's a real propaganda success. This idea that people are working hard. Remember that purges are going on at the same time. So there's this idea that, yes, there are bad people being bad and they are being punished by the purges, but there are goodies, and the goodies are working really hard, and you know what side you want to be on. You want to be on the goodie side, who aren't being purged, than the baddie side, who are being purged. So it really encourages this idea of, let's just work hard and I'll prove my loyalty, and that suits Stalin down to the ground. Obviously, the Stakhanovites, if you are not a Stakhanovite, you look at these people lording it over you about how much coal they mined and how useless you are, and it causes resentments. And they actually, in reality, the Stakhanovite program is quietly dropped in 1938 because a lot of Stakhanovites are killed by their sort of jealous rivals and jealous co-workers who go, well, I don't want to work that hard, and you're making me look bad. So to some extent, it is a literal failure in terms of it doesn't massively make lots more stuff, but it's a fantastic propaganda success.
So what was life like in this new industrialized Russia? The massive urbanization actually caused problems. The rise in slum districts, poor, cramped conditions. Life in urban Russia was akin to life in Victorian England in many ways, in some of the factory towns. I suppose life of an average Russian industrial worker can be summed up by the term nasty, brutish, and short. 10 million women entered the workforce, and that's a really important point. One of the aspects of industrialization that you need to understand is the fact that this is not just a male-dominated workforce like the workforces of many Western countries. At the same time, women are working in large numbers to meet the demand for workers. For instance, 45% of the Leningrad factory workers were women by 1935.
There are lots of, but however, because there are shortages in consumer goods, particularly stuff that people just need on a day-to-day basis, not like fancy stuff like TVs or radios or even bikes, but the basic stuff that people need. This meant that there was a shortage of these consumer goods, stuff that you need just to keep going, like plates, knives and forks, clothes. And because there's shortages, you have to queue up to get them, and even they might all be gone when you're at the back, when they're turning at the front of the queue. So that causes some dissent and resentment, but also just poor quality of life. And actually, because the state controls every job, they can afford to reduce the size of wages. Now, what they don't do is they don't actually cut everyone's wages. They just everything becomes more expensive, and the states don't rise the wages. What happens is wages fall in real terms, like how much you can actually buy with your money, by 50%. What this might mean is you are still paid 100 rubles. You haven't lost any more money, but now everything's twice as expensive, and so therefore you can buy half the amount of things. Okay, so for example, whereas a woolly jumper would have been 10 rubles, it's now 20 rubles. And then you're like, I've still got 100 rubles, what do I do? And it's obviously, as like these urbanized massive cities increase, eventually even these cramped houses run out of space. And there's shanty towns which are formed, causing disease, poverty.
So the economic effects of industrialization. Number one, there was a huge modernization and transformation of industry. In many ways, that was quite successful and was exactly what Stalin wanted. There was increased production as compared to collectivization, where production didn't go up massively. There is massively increased production in heavy industries, other key industries. Really, truly an unprecedented rate. Even though Russia wasn't necessarily prepared adequately for World War II, they were much better prepared than they would have been. And in many ways, had industrialization not happened, World War II could have ended up very, very different. The quality of goods produced, though, were often poor, as evidenced by the Soviet tanks, which often broke down before they ever making it to the battlefield. Inefficiencies still clog the system, wasting resources and time.
Politically, it's less obvious, but now many workers were under direct control and supervision through the state, i.e. a manager knows their name, he's got powers to punish you if he's not obedient. What it does is it increases this sense of you are being watched, you are being controlled, you need to be a cog in our machine, and therefore it leads to a little bit more control. For example, fines and control of everyday life, losing houses, being purged, perhaps even being thrown to prison or a prison camp for not working hard enough, means that you are more likely to be tracked. You've got an internal passport. There's just more stuff keeping an eye on you, making sure you're obedient. That now, at the end of industrialisation, than before. And as well as this, the use of Stakhanovites causes something called divide and rule, i.e. the workers stop being against the state and start hating each other and rivaling each other. If they're rivaling each other to impress the state, Stalin, for example, it has the power. If everyone's trying to impress him, impress the government, they are not trying to fight him, and therefore he has more control. Yes, industrialisation causes some anger, people's living conditions are terrible, but because the purges at the same time, nobody says anything. And this is why the purges are key. The purges mean that collectivisation and industrialisation work. Without the purges, people won't be scared, and we'll see lots more problems.
So in summary, the 5-year plans are ultimately a positive in terms of growth. However, this growth is uneven. It's also sometimes counterproductive. It's ridden with inefficiency. The goods that were produced, again, were of poor quality, and the quality of life. And in all things we see, collectivization, industrialization, during the time of Stalin, life got considerably worse for the people. However, well, things got worse for the people, the amount of control that the Communist Party, and more acutely Stalin, had increased. So that's all we got for today. That's industrialization.
See you soon.